Hi folks, Greg Marchand here. Welcome to another episode of the Virtual Instructor-Led Training Program brought to you by the Service Sales Academy. In this episode, I want to talk about selling steering system components. I kind of combine the technical piece of the steering system thing with the selling program to save you a little bit of time maybe. All right. When do you sell these components? Let's think about this because there are some significant challenges to selling these. You might sell some when the customer notices some sort of concern. Maybe it's a power steering pump squeal. Maybe it's a hitch in the steering. Maybe it's a clunk. Maybe it's some sort of noise. Maybe it's a steering wheel off center. Maybe they come walking through the door with a concern. Most of the time, however, they don't, or they have a concern they don't necessarily relate to steering. It could be more often likely that you'll find it on an alignment inspection. You'll find it while your technicians are doing a courtesy inspection. Or maybe there's some other repair that you're performing and you find some related issue or some component issue with the steering system. Your general sales process is to, when the customer comes through the door, to listen to that concern. So maybe they have some sort of need recognition there, and they already have something that they want fixed. So your job is to listen and to gather that information. And then once the technician looks at it, you're going to explain the alternatives and the options. Ask the customer for feedback, as in, do they need more information? Do they understand what you've said, etc.? Ask for the sale and manage the customer relationship. All right. Now, that sales process has to fit the customer buying process. And here's the customer buying process that we've seen a few dozen times now. It begins with need recognition. Now, think about that, right? The customer that walks through the door that has a squealing noise from under the hood, they recognize they need something fixed. The customer that brought you an alignment, they don't always recognize that they may need a tie rod end or they may need a ball joint. So need recognition becomes really key in your sales process because that's what they are going through in their mind. Once they have need recognition, they're going to figure out who can help with that need, what the alternatives and options are surrounding resolving that condition, make a decision, and then they'll have some post-purchase behavior, hopefully a positive Google review. The challenge with steering system components is that there isn't always that need recognition. They're not always well known to a customer. Oftentimes they're not well known. If you use the word power steering, that'll resonate with them because they know they want power steering. They certainly not want power steering. In other words, they want it to work and they don't not want it to not work. But otherwise, they don't have a real strong awareness. Steering wheel, the tie rod end, steering rack, steering gearbox, drag link, all these other words that describe components or parts of the system, they don't know them very well. And so not only is it a lack of knowledge, but they can also be hard to visualize, sometimes hard to understand, because they just can't put the word with a picture in their mind or relate it to some previous experience. And so it does require a certain level of trust with you or sales skill on your part. And I prefer to think it's sales skill leading to a level of trust. I strongly recommend using the 3 C's. We've talked about this in a few other programs, but the 3 C's were invented, if you will, to help somebody that doesn't have a real strong technical knowledge about an automobile decide whether that's the appropriate thing to do or not. It was a warranty administrator sitting in a cubicle somewhere 3,000 miles from where the actual repair took place, and he or she had to say, okay, so this is what the customer said was wrong, or the technician said was wrong, here's what caused it, and there's what they got to do to fix it. And if that made sense to them, then they would say, okay. Well, think about that. That's what we want the customer to do, right? We want the customer to connect to the complaint. This is what you may have been noticing if they didn't have a concern to begin with. Maybe they brought it in for an oil change and you find a loose tie rod on a courtesy inspection. And you say to the customer, you may have noticed. And sometimes that, with the right things, that brings them back to, yeah, you know what, come to think of it, I did. So it could be what they came in with, what their actual concern was, or it could be something you found and you begin the conversation with, you may have noticed. And then you tell them, what it is. With steering systems, it's usually time or mileage or rough roads, or you bumped the curb, some sort of accident, usually not a major one, or they have an awareness. And the correction's always with steering components to put new parts in and align the vehicle. So let's take a closer look at this. Components of the steering system, You can have a steering gearbox, rack and pinion steering, depending on the vehicle. Rack and pinion is the most common right now. Tie rods, ball joints, by the way, tie rods are inner and outer. Ball joints, other steering linkages, all right? Weird words, kind of, when you think about it. I mean, we're around them, so we don't think twice about it, but to a customer, they can be a little bit different. Here's an example of a steering gearbox, and I gave you a diagram from the steering wheel down so you can kind of see where it's connected. The steering shaft from the steering wheel enters that gearbox, and essentially the rotational direction of the steering wheel gets transmitted into the left and right direction that the wheels need to turn in. So inside that steering gearbox are some gears. Imagine that. We won't get into how it works because there's some fanciness in there, but just know that it changes the direction of input, if you will. All right. We more commonly, of course, we can have a rack and pinion steering, and there's two photos in this picture. The bottom one is the actual rack and pinion assembly with the inner tie rod ends, and the two pieces you see on either end sticking out there are the inner tie rod ends. I'll show you a picture of just those in just a minute. The top picture there is a model, all right, but I liked the picture because it does really show you or show a customer how this works. You can see the piece in black there will rotate in a circular motion. So you can picture that shaft up there connected to the steering wheel. And as they turn it left and right, the gears on the black piece will interface with the gears on the yellow piece, and that yellow piece will move left and right, back and forth. And so it takes that rotational motion of the steering wheel and turns it into a lateral motion, a back and forth motion. All right, and that's a rack and pinion steering gear example. Now these could be power, they could be manual, almost all of them are power. And today, they can be electric as well, electric or hydraulic. Hydraulic uses the fluid and the fluid pump, whereas the electric just uses an electric motor, and that electric motor takes input from the steering wheel and moves that yellow piece back and forth. The tie rods, here's the picture I promised you. On this side here, on the right hand side, there's the inner tie rod end, and I should say the top picture is the inner tie rod end, and the bottom picture is the outer tie rod end. Where the red arrow is, you can see where the tie rod end connects to the steering knuckle. And so in the boot piece there, the black boot piece to the upside of the arrow is the end of that power steering rack. So that's where the inner tie rod end comes out of the steering rack. It connects to the outer tie rod end, which then attaches to the steering knuckle. So we take that force from the steering wheel, we take the rotational force, we turn it into a lateral motion, and that lateral motion gets moved to the steering knuckle via that outer tie rod end. Okay, probably a little more than you really wanted, but you know what? You can probably use it too. Now, some people consider ball joints part of the suspension system, and we talked about them in the technical knowledge suspension system portion or program, I should say. But look, you could make the case they're part of the steering system too, because they allow that steering knuckle to turn left and right. And if it doesn't turn, we don't have steering. So you can make a case for either one. The really shiny picture there, I'm not entirely convinced that's out of an automotive application, but it's a great example of a ball joint, and it really gives you a good internal look at what these ball joints are composed of and how they're likely to operate. The picture on the other side there is the actual upper ball joint in the vehicle itself. All right, and they allow that steering knuckle to turn left and right. If there's a McPherson strut system in the automobile, you're only going to have one ball joint, and that will be on the lower ball joint. If you're not using McPherson struts, like a lot of trucks do not use McPherson struts, you'll have an upper and lower ball joint. That McPherson strut, if you remember from the suspension program, just allows that whole assembly to turn left and right. And it's got the strut as part of that whole assembly. If it doesn't use that, then we're going to have an upper and lower ball joint. So steering rack and or steering gearbox, some sort of linkage. In our case, we've talked about tie rods and tie rod ends, and then the ball joint that allows that whole assembly to turn. You can have other steering linkages too. Most of these systems are used with a steering gearbox. You can have, they'll call, different manufacturers call them by different terms, but they'll be drag links is one common term, but they're a whole bunch of rods with little ball joints on the end of them. They look like tie rod ends on the end of them to allow all of this to turn and to move up and down with the suspension as well. So a whole bunch of different pieces that allow either change of direction from that driver input or the suspension to move the pieces up and down, or the steering knuckle to move them left to right. Now, what's the really important part? The really important part is what the customer is going to notice. These pieces tend to, they'll loosen up, they'll corrode sometimes, but the customer will generally notice a few things. Clunks or bumps maybe, maybe over bumps, maybe starting and stopping, maybe when they turn the wheel. They might notice the steering wheel's off center. Sometimes they'll notice even if they hold the wheel straight, the vehicle will kind of wander going down the road. Or maybe they'll feel the looseness in the steering wheel. Many times, I hate to say it, they won't notice a thing. They'll notice absolutely nothing until you call their attention to it. Now, when you call their attention to it, this is, you can say to them, you may have noticed, but if they haven't noticed, they haven't noticed. And so the complaint piece is just kind of, it's out there, but we haven't really connected the customer to it yet. So then we kind of get into, well, what's causing what I'm about to talk about? And you begin that conversation with, well, over time, or with 200,000 miles on your vehicle, or, the roads we have around here are awful rough. And every time you hit one of those potholes, there's a ton of force on these components. And that's the honest truth. There's a ton of force on these components. And then if we add in there hitting curbs, hitting potholes, or somebody bumping into us on the road, whatever it might be, we'll get all kinds of wear. And, sometimes they'll notice fluid leaks, pump failure, things like that. All of these things will create looseness and or drips under the car. They may or may not create noises, okay? So there's a bunch of things that can go wrong. Most of the time it's just from driving it down the road and the force on these things. Other times it's, seals will go bad if it's a hydraulic power steering system. What the technician's going to look for, and what the technician will find, is looseness or play that's out of specification. So things are moving around too much, and they can measure it with a dial indicator. That picture there is a picture of a dial indicator. They can measure it with a dial indicator, and they compare that to the manufacturer's specification. So the manufacturer might say, you can have up to 1/8 of an inch of play in a ball joint. Or they might say, you can't have any play in a ball joint. And they're all different. So it's important to measure it and compare it to specification, and then you have something to show the customer. And you can say, look, whoever it is, Toyota says you shouldn't have any play in this ball joint, and look how much we've just measured. This tells us that it's bad, and we need to replace it. And that's something visual that you can show them. You can even do a video of it. And technicians are getting better at doing videos of these things, but you can show them that they don't have to understand everything there is about it. They don't have to know what that fancy tool is, but they can just see that, all right, so the manufacturer says nothing, and boy, it looks like there's something there. So therefore, that person must be telling me the truth. The technician may find noises. On a test drive, they might find loose components. They might notice a noise that the customer never noticed while they were driving it. Maybe the customer drives around with the radio turned up. I know some don't, but some do. And so they never hear the squeal. They never hear the squeal in startup that might mean a pump going bad. They never hear a loose component rattling around under the car while they're driving down the road. But your technician should find these things. And they may also find the alignments out of specification. Many times customers know this is tire wear, and so they bring it to you. But they don't realize the tire wear is due to a steering component being worn or out of specification. Oftentimes, this is just due to normal driving too. You drive down the road with a perfectly aligned automobile, you hit one bump, you slightly move a suspension or steering component, maybe you slightly bend a tie rod, not so as anybody would notice it, but just enough that your alignment's out now. And now you're wearing tires. And it's because it needs an adjustment. Look, there's a reason we built adjustments into these things, because stuff happens to them. At some point, when we can't adjust it anymore, we're probably going to have to put parts on though, right? Unless it's loose and falling out of the automobile. Then we know we're going to have to put parts on. Your sales job is to understand some of this at a very high level. Understand the inspection report. Ask the technician, and you can use the 3 C's with the technician too, because that'll help you translate that back to the customer. Ask the technicians whatever questions you may have so you can clarify. What would the customer notice? Why did this happen? What do we have to do to fix this? Get your visual tools ready. Whether it's video, whether it's photos, whether it's models, whether it's animations. Get those visual tools ready to sell to the customer. Because when you sell to the customer, you're going to use those 3 C's. And you're going to present the complaint, what you may have noticed if they didn't have one, what caused this, normal wear and tear. You've got 250,000 miles on your automobile. It's probably about time this happened, quite honestly. Or, you know, with the roads around here, et cetera, et cetera. And then here's what we got to do to take care of this. We're going to replace the component and we're going to align the vehicle so everything is returned to factory specifications. Once you present that, those 3 C's, ask the customer for feedback. You know, do you have a better understanding of what I'm talking about now? So to fix this, we need to replace the ball joint and align the vehicle. That'll protect your tire wear. Does that make sense to you based on what I've shown you? Yes or no, or you can tell by the look on their face that you've got to go back to giving a little more of an explanation, maybe showing them the animation, maybe, you know, pulling out a video, or maybe taking them back, showing them the automobile and let the technician explain it to them. Okay, once you ask for that feedback and you know that they've got a good understanding, you can move on to asking for the sale. And ask for the sale. Look, if you've shown the customer what's wrong and explain why, and they get it, you're at a yes. So all you got to do is ask for the sale, and they'll say yes. Because honestly, you don't even have to be a rock star here, because they know something's wrong. At this point, they know something's wrong. If you can show them play and show them the specification, then they know they're not lying to you most of the time. I heard a recent story where it was a little bit different. You know, it showed up on a courtesy inspection that they needed to replace some suspension components. They had specifications. They had video. And the customer drove 2,000 miles home, had their technicians look at it, and their technician said, "Nah, you're all set, no problem." Look, those are one-offs. Don't worry about those. Be honest. You know, if your technicians do a good job and they've documented whatever it is that they say this thing needs, and they have the specifications, then you're okay. No matter what anybody says, you're okay. You haven't done anything wrong. If you can give all this information to the customer, they're going to say yes, even if they don't fully understand it, because they don't know what else to ask, honestly. The better job you do explaining it, the more comfortable they'll be, the better they'll feel about saying yes and after saying yes for that post-purchase behavior. Steering components are more difficult because that need recognition isn't always there. They're a little bit more complex in explaining to a customer why they need it, because they don't always look bad. Look, if your rotors are just shredded, I can show you a bad rotor and you look at the rotor and you go, "Oh yeah, that's kind of obvious." If I say a tie rod end needs to be replaced because it's too loose, even if I show it to you, it doesn't always look bad enough that I can go, "Oh wow, yeah." I still have to have some trust in you. And so that's where the repair information comes in, the pictures, the videos, the whole big picture explanation of what this component does. Because maybe I recognize, well, look, you know what, I can't tell if that's really bad or not, but I do know that connects my steering wheel to the wheels. And that's probably a good thing. So let's not mess with it. Let's just go ahead and spend a few $100. If you understand what these components are and what they do, you'll have more confidence in your selling, and that confidence will translate into higher customer trust. But have your visual selling tools ready, because it is more difficult to build that need recognition. All right, and look, even if you don't have a ton of confidence, even if you don't feel like you've done just a rock star of a job, ask for the sale anyway. Because look, worst case, they'll say, "No, I'm going to get a second opinion," and then you're back to step one, and you can try again. Best case, they'll say, "Yeah, why don't you just go ahead and do it?" Because hey, they don't want to take a chance. It's steering. Okay? So practice, folks. Think about it. Let me know if you have any questions. Keep up the great work until we meet again, and never ever stop learning.